Hello, everyone. Welcome to another Peace Islands New York event. And today we'll be covering spirituality in the modern world, Catholic and Muslim perspectives. And we have two distinguished speakers. James Martin is a Jesuit priest, editor at large of America. And most recently, he has a New York Times bestseller titled Learning to Pray, a Guide for Everyone, and the link is below the YouTube video you're currently watching. So when the opportunity avails, please review the book. Welcome, Father James.
Thank you very much. Good to be with you both.
Thank you. And our second speaker is Dr. Zuleyha Keskin, who is an academic and course director at the Center for Islamic Studies and Civilization at Charles Sturt University. She is also a lecturer in Islamic spirituality and contemporary Islamic studies. And details of her latest book are also in the description on the YouTube video you're currently watching just below. It's titled Attaining Inner Peace in Islam, Said Nursi's Perspective. And we also recently did an event around Said Nursi and what Christians can learn from his understanding. So the video link to that will also be at the end of this video. Again, welcome to everyone. Welcome to our speakers. If you're first time here, please take a moment to like this video and, of course, subscribe to our YouTube channel. And we'll be starting with Dr. Zuleyha Keskin. The floor is yours. Welcome again to both of you. Thank you.
Thanks, Emre, and thanks, James, as well, for letting me go first. Or maybe I would just got the shorter straw. Anyway, so I've been asked to talk about spirituality in the modern world. And so there's a few questions, and as I talk about them, I'll go through one to the other. But before we even go into like what is spirituality, or the impact or benefits of spirituality, or the challenge of spirituality in the modern world, we need to understand, what do we mean by spirituality? It is a word that's quite loosely used and referred to. So I want to first, mention what it is, the way I understand it from an Islamic perspective, and then I can further talk about spiritual growth and so forth. Now, the word spirituality comes from the word spiritual, and this links well with the Islamic understanding of the spirit, which means the ruh, which is an important component, the key component of a human being. And the way that we would understand the spirit in Islam is that, the human body really is a spirit with a physical body. This will, already give you an indication of, I guess the way that the human body is perceived differently, by the Islamic faith tradition, as opposed to in the modern world. Because in the modern world, we don't even talk about spirit. We might talk about the physical body and empowering ourselves, growing, and so forth. But the starting point from an Islamic perspective is that we are a spirit entity with a physical body, not a physical body with a spirit. Now, they're quite distinctly different things. That's where we're starting, the spirit. So when we're talking about spirituality or growing in spirituality, there is a strong connection of spirituality with one's connection with God. You could basically say that it encapsulates one's belief and connection with God is at the foundation of the Islamic faith, and spiritual growth is based on that. But spirituality is more than belief and knowledge and belief. It's also influenced by one's thoughts, one's words, one's actions. Basically, everything that one does, thinks, says, is influences in one way their spirituality. And therefore, the starting point about spiritual growth is for one to know God, and then to by knowing God, having a connection, a love for God. And that love for God then leads to one wanting to worship God. So that kind of sequence is really important, especially if we want to, approach spirituality in the modern world. Asking people to do these acts of goodness or these deeds commanded by God is really going to be quite, you know, in a way, hollow maybe, or not. It's not going to really work if the audience you're talking to does not even have a belief or strong belief or connection with God. And another important thing about spirituality in Islam is that it's strongly connected with purifying the ego, which is the nafs in Arabic. So the ego is another entity that's in the human body. And one of the life goals of a Muslim is to purify that ego. In a way, you can think of the ego and the spirit as an impure ego and the spirit competing with each other. The ego wants to do things now, wants to gratify its desires now. It wants immediate pleasure. It thinks of itself as being grandiose. It doesn't want to surrender to a God because it thinks that it's got everything it needs, and that God can't give it anything more. It doesn't feel indebted to God. That's an impure ego. So therefore, you could see how for spiritual growth to happen in Islam, purifying the ego is a very important part of that process. Purification of the ego. Now, I guess with all that in mind, a question that was posed to me is, what was my spiritual growth? And I can connect it to all that I have mentioned. I was born into a Muslim family, and you might assume that, that naturally meant spirituality, but it actually didn't. And I think that's the reality with every human being. When we're born into a particular family, a particular faith, it really starts off with blind faith. We accept things because our parents accepted it. We accept things because society tells us to accept it. I guess for me, my spiritual growth really happened when that blind faith turned into faith that was based on knowledge and conviction. And it probably started a long while ago now, when I was 17 years old. And really the thing that drove it was the knowledge. Before that, even though I was born into a Muslim family, I had questions like, does God really exist? If he does exist, who is he? What is he one? What does he expect from me? Why am I even on this earth? So I'm not going to go into answering those questions, but through my spiritual journey, I guess, or awakening, let's call it, I was answering those kind of questions. And that created a huge shift in my paradigm, in my worldview, into life. And it became more about, how do I do justice to myself and to God and my relationship with God through what I read, what I learn, and also what I do. And that's where I guess, it's like, the question of, how important is faith and worship in spirituality? I would say that, faith and spirituality, I would say, are quite similar. There's very nuanced differences between those, because you can't really, I believe, have spirituality unless you have faith. And from an Islamic perspective, by faith, I mean to believe in Allah, God, to believe in the Quran, and through that, having a connection with God in a way that satisfies the spirit, really. And worship, therefore, is a really important part of that, but it's not a be-all, end-all. So you could say that spiritual development really is the ultimate goal of the Islamic tradition. It really is all about spiritual growth, spirituality. And so everything, as I said, one does helps to contribute towards that. But the starting point is knowledge. And so when I say everything we do, I'll give some examples. Now, often we hear about the 5 pillars of Islam. When you look at those, all those practices are about, again, purifying the ego and also connecting with God. But they do assume, again, that there is a strong foundational knowledge about God. Otherwise, if the foundation's not there, a lot of these practices would just not have the effect. And it might even sometimes have the opposite effect that they're meant to have. So I want to give you an example of one. let's talk about fasting, because the month of Ramadan just finished less than 2 weeks ago. And so Muslims were fasting, from dawn to sunset. How does this practice, worship, help with spiritual growth? So again, going back to the ego, a key part of fasting is to tame or purify the ego, basically telling it, you're not in control. You can't do what you want when you want to. You can't eat and drink when you want to. So having that kind of training of the ego really helps the spirit to thrive, to grow, and that's where spiritual growth helps to take place. But also fasting was a way, or is a way, for one to remember where the sustenance comes from. And then that in itself provides a connection with God. So the purer the ego, the more pure the ego, the greater the connection with God, because those two are not competing. And that's, I guess this is why spirituality or spiritual growth, although knowledge is a key part of it, it cannot be the only thing. Practices are also an important part of it. It's a bit like, being physically healthy. Knowing how to be physically healthy is not enough. Walking the talk or doing what needs to be done to be physically healthy is just as important. And that's where these kind of practices like fasting or the 5 daily prayers are really important, because they're a means to connect one to God. Now, with regards to what are the current challenges to developing our spirituality, I would say that we're living in a world, in the modern world, where instant gratification is a big part of our life, where we're so used to getting what we want almost instantly. And this isn't good for our spirituality, because the more you get instant gratification, the more you want it. And an important part of spiritual growth is patience, endurance, perseverance, contentment. And so we are quite challenged in this way. And again, this is why having practices that pull us away from this instant gratification lifestyle are critical. I would say another obstacle in the modern world would be the competing gods. When I say that, competing gods, I mean that in this context, what I mean by God is something that we give so much value to that it determines our identity, it determines our values, it determines our actions, our decisions. So this competing God could be money, it could be fame, it could be beauty, and it could be our job description. So when that becomes our primary drive in life, that is a huge hindrance on our spirituality, because that means then that our primary drive is not to live our life according to the way God would want us to, but we would live it according to the way that mini God would want us to. I hope that nuanced difference makes sense. But we are living in the modern world. There are many of those, I guess, competing mini gods that influence our decision making, that influence our actions, and that has a huge impact, and it's a huge impediment to our spiritual growth. Probably another big impediment or challenge to spirituality is the bad practices that we see people of faith undertaking. It's easier said than done to say, don't connect what people do with the faith. Think about the faith that's on its own. As human beings, we observe, we see what people are doing. So if we're seeing a particular a person that belongs to a particular faith tradition undertaking bad acts or things that are outright wrong, it leaves a mark on people, especially those who don't fully understand that faith, and so it does a huge injustice to that religion and people of that religion, and that can also impact on spirituality, because people say, I don't want a bar of that religion. If that is what faith tradition is, I don't want anything to do with it. I'd rather just go work and live my life in this world without thinking about God. So without realizing, bad practices, bad culture could be pushing people away from spirituality. And I think we see that a lot in the modern world. Now, how are there opportunities to learn from other faith traditions? I certainly think there is. I've been involved in interfaith dialogue for many years, probably more than 2 decades. Now, it's not easy. This idea of learning from other faith traditions is not an easy point to come to. And the reason for that is we're living again in a society where religions are competing, or religions are seen as being the other, or even sometimes the enemy. And so when you have this, I guess, worldview, or when you're living in a world where different religions are grouped separately and as rivals almost, it's not easy to think, how can I spiritually grow? Or how can knowing about another faith tradition or interacting with someone from another faith tradition help me to spiritually grow? So you can see how there are a number of obstacles there to be able to do this. But once these obstacles are overcome, and once you think, that there are good people in all faith traditions, sincere people who've devoted themselves to God, it can really change the way we view that person, but also what we can learn from that person. And I have to say, for me, I probably had a big paradigm shift when I went on an interfaith international trip, where it was we had 11 Christians and 11 Muslims, and we did a trip this was many years ago, to Istanbul and to Rome. And when you're traveling, all your guards come down. So because you're grumpy, you're tired, you're jet lagged, you become more the raw yourself, which I think was a good thing. And you start to see the raw, the others from their raw perspective as well. And what I found was that we really connected at the human level. And I started to see some of the practices that they, in this case, our Christian brothers and sisters were doing, which I thought, that is fascinating. That is amazing. It was on that trip that, I was able to, appreciate that, I guess the life of particularly priests and nuns who had sacrificed not getting married for the sake of God. And I thought, wow, that is such a huge sacrifice. And they're doing this purely for the sake of God. I was able to, sit in that position and appreciate what they were doing. This didn't mean that I was willing to do it, or that from my faith tradition, it expected that of me, but I was able to put myself in their situation and appreciate what they were doing. Another example was, we would go somewhere, and then we had Bishop Prowse at the time with us, and we would go visit somewhere, and then we'll all get back on the bus, like, school kids back on the bus. And he would say, let's reflect now on what we have experienced. Let's reflect on it. And I love this. And this is an important part of, where you can spiritually grow by looking at other faith traditions. Reflection is an important part of the Islamic tradition as well, especially for spiritual growth. It's known as tafakkur in Arabic, and it's mentioned many times in the Quran. So reflection is a key part of Islam, but it's a practice that I believe that we don't do enough. So when you see a practice like reflection being done by another faith tradition, you scan your faith tradition, you think, where does this fit in with my faith tradition, and how can I do it more because it looks beautiful from where I'm doing it? So I think that's this is where other faith traditions and how connecting with them and interacting with them can help us with our spiritual growth. And so there are many examples like that. But the question about, is it possible to experience spirituality from other traditions? I think this gets a bit more trickier, because our spirituality is based on a set beliefs and a set worldview. Now, as I mentioned, there could be strong correlations between beliefs and worldviews between religions, but they clearly are not identical. Otherwise, they would be the same faith tradition, right? So there are distinct differences. Therefore, to say that you can experience spirituality from other faith traditions means you need to get into that faith tradition. It means you need to accept those set of beliefs. It means you need to accept that set worldview, which would really not be, I guess, then you wouldn't be sincere or loyal to your faith tradition. So I think when we do experience, or when we do spiritually grow with other faith traditions in mind, it is because we identify practices and concepts that they are, I guess, in doing or experiencing, and thinking, where does this sit within my faith tradition? And trying to bring that out from your own faith tradition. And this can be done, in multiple, with all faiths, I believe. In that trip that I mentioned to you, for example, Muslims pray 5 times a day. Our Christian brothers and sisters, they were drawn to that aspect of the Islamic faith, saying, wow, that ongoing commitment to God, and pausing 5 times a day to pray, they found it to be admirable. But they were able to find within their faith tradition how they could increase their regular connection with God, through could be reflection or through reading, and enrich their own experience. So I do believe that there is great opportunity for spiritual growth, through interfaith dialogue, by seeing the good practices that are being undertaken by others. And I think we need to do more of it, because I do believe in many parts of the world that we live in today, we are living in spiritual deserts. We're living in places where it's very material, very worldly, and any opportunity that we have to become more, spiritually vibrant, we need to take that up and embrace it. And hopefully we're able to achieve that. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Keskin. Just as a reminder to our audience, we've received some comments, but by all means, please type your questions into the YouTube chat box to the right of the screen. That's a polite reminder. We'll be taking those questions and posing them to our speakers. So now the floor is yours, Father James. Welcome again. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I want to thank Dr. Keskin. I think I could have repeated everything you said. It was so well done. And I resonate with you in so many areas. And you'll see some of my answers are pretty much exactly the same. I think I'll go through the question by question. How has your faith and worship shaped your spirituality? So I agree with Dr. Keskin that spirituality is about God. It's about your relationship with God. And I think that so often today people say, oh, I'm spiritual. And it's very vague, and I say, well, it sounds like they're saying I'm a good person or I live a moral life. But, as Doctor was saying, it is about Ruah, which is the spirit. And when we talk about spirituality, it is about the Spirit. We would say in Catholicism, the Holy Spirit of God. And so it is a connection to God through the Spirit. My own faith, of course, you have to have faith in God before you can connect with God. You have to believe that there's a God out there or around us. And so that's a precondition for spirituality. I really believe that. And then worship, we are naturally, as I see, there's private worship, of course, but when I hear worship, I think of communal worship, and we are naturally social beings. And so there's a reason why we feel drawn to one another and drawn to worship together. I think one of the difficulties of the pandemic, as wonderful as Zoom services are, is that we are naturally social. We want to worship together, and it's natural. So I think to be able to worship together deepens your spirituality, and it reminds you that it's not just about you and God. That is a very limited way of looking at the spiritual life. How might you describe the importance of spiritual development, and how does one become more spiritual? That's a big question. I think it's a lifetime to answer. And Doctor was talking about good works, which is one path. But as she said, without faith, it is, I know you were struggling for a word. I was trying to think what word I would use too. It is a little empty and it is a little shallow. And I think you can't sustain it. That's the other thing. If you set out just to do good works, I think the faith sustains you, because oftentimes we don't see the results of our good works, right? People who work in a lot of social justice areas sometimes get frustrated because they don't see the results. But with the faith, you know that God is bringing these things to completion in some way, even if you can't see it. And so, you know, I would say one of the ways of becoming more spiritual is through works, but it is also through prayer and noticing God around you. I'm a Jesuit priest, and one of the insights of the Jesuit tradition is that we call it finding God in all things. So it's not simply in Holy Scriptures or during Mass or in a mosque or in a synagogue, but it is throughout your day. It's looking for those connections to God that God is revealed to you through relationships, through work, through family, through nature, through music, that every moment really is a chance to encounter God. And so I think one way that people become more spiritual is by noticing more. You talked about the reflection, Doctor, on that bus. And it's funny, I too found a lot, I'll talk about this later, a lot of insights about other religions from travel as well. But I think that reflecting time is a very important time for us to be able to, in the Christian tradition especially, to look back at the day and to say, where was God, right? Where were you, God? I think looking back, as that bishop, I think you said, on the bus, you know, was able to invite you to over the previous hour or the previous 2 hours, you can do that during the day. You can do that, you know, for a lifetime, really, kind of to look back to see where God was. One of my favorite passages from the Old Testament is where God says to Moses, you cannot see my face, but you will see me pass. So it's like you can see God better as God passes. It's easier to see God kind of in the past, and that enables you to see God more in the present and the future. What are the current challenges to developing our spirituality? I totally agree that it is becoming a much more secular world, and there are so many things that are pushing against us in the modern world to make us sort of move away from religion, to the point where I think people think that sometimes people who are religious are either stupid or deluded or not well educated, you know, which would surprise all the great religious scholars. But there's a push from the secular world to, I would say, you know, in a sense, denigrate religion as a kind of the province of people who are very superstitious. So I agree with that. I think the other challenge is really the sort of fast pace of our world today. It just makes people busier, which means that they feel that they have less time for God. There's a great Catholic saint, Saint Francis de Sales. I love this quote. Was once asked, "How often should you pray? How long should you pray for?" And Francis de Sales said, half an hour a day. Unless you're busy, then you pray an hour a day. Which is great. You know, it reminds us that we, you know, especially busy people, need more time to take that time to reflect and to look back. So one of the current challenges is simply the busyness and the fast pace of life. I think the other big challenge is this, really. I think that the phone, I'm holding up a phone in case you can't see, is extremely, you know, there are some things that can help you with prayer. You can go online, you can see, you know, obviously shows like this online on the computer. There are places you can kind of go to kind of be inspired, to like sort of imagine yourself in places. You can learn about prayer, you can learn about the religious life and the spiritual life. But I also see people who are completely addicted to their phones. And I often say that in order to connect with God, you have to disconnect with media, with social media. They're certainly finding God in all things is important, but at some point you need that one-on-one time with God, right? In my book, Learning to Pray, I talk about prayer as a personal relationship, the connection. And in any personal relationship, you need time. You need time, you need attention to listen to God in your prayer, to think about what's coming up in your prayer, the emotions, the insights, the memories, the desires, the feelings. Also to look and reflect about where God is during your daily life. And you can't do that when you're completely attached to your phone. And that's a difficult thing, especially with young people, to convince them. But I think comparing our prayer and our spiritual life to a relationship is very helpful, because you say, who's the most important person in your life? And they say, oh, my brother, my sister, my father, my boyfriend, my girlfriend, my husband, my wife. And you say, well, do you spend a lot of one-on-one time with them? Well, of course, they're very important. How about God? Spend a lot of one-on-one time with God? I'm too busy. So it's cultivating that. And one of the ways to do that is really to carve out time, which is getting more difficult for people. Are there opportunities to learn from other faith traditions? Absolutely. And, I was thinking, even before I got on this phone call, I have many friends from different faith traditions. I would say more Jewish friends than Muslim friends. But one of the places that I've learned most about different faith traditions is in the Holy Land, is in Jerusalem. And I've traveled there many times. And one of the things I found, it's funny you should say that, Doctor. I do find that the 5 times a day prayer is just fantastic. And I just find it a challenge in a good way, because I'm not doing that. I am not stopping my day 5 times and kneeling down and praying. And every time I'm with a group of Catholics who sees that, we are just in awe. It's a beautiful thing to see it. And I'll tell you, so I live in New York, as you know, and I run in Central Park every other day. And there are a group of, I guess they're called pedicabs, the carts that the guy has a bike, and there's a carriage behind him, and they take tourists for rides. And there's a group of Muslim pedicab drivers who usually, when I'm running about 4:30, there they are, all facing in the right direction, all on their, excuse me if I don't get the terminology right, all on their prayer rugs. It's incredibly moving to me. And I say, I'm a priest, and I'm not doing that 5 times a day. I'm going running. I should be down there with them. And I also, to say on a very personal note, I find and I learned this from my Muslim brothers and sisters, I find that the posture of kneeling with your forehead to the ground is tremendously helpful for me. And I pray that way sometimes when I'm alone. I pray that way when I'm in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. Even though the first time I did it, I just felt so moved to do it, because I had seen it, and it just seems to me as a great, I think this is one of the meanings of the word Islam, a great act of submission to God. It just felt so powerful. And I'll share with you, the first time I did it, I felt very self-conscious, because I had my collar on. I thought people are going to think I'm, making some sort of display or saying some sort of statement. But now that's how I pray when I'm really, when I'm in need, when I really feel like I need to express myself, and certainly in the presence of the holy. So I learned a lot from just seeing Muslims pray without even, I mean, obviously I have Muslim friends, but I mean, just the physical nature of the prayer, I just found tremendously helpful. So yes, we can learn from other faith traditions. And certainly from my Jewish brothers and sisters, I learn about, for me, I learn about Jesus's background. I mean, and so it is tremendously helpful for me to understand. Now that sounds very sort of functional, as in I only learn about Judaism in order to understand Jesus. But for me as a Catholic priest, I find that the most exciting and the most wonderful. And so my many Jewish friends have taught me about Judaism, and they have also taught me about Jesus. So I just find that just so wonderful. Is it possible to experience spirituality from other faith traditions? Absolutely. I think that those practices I was talking about in Islam, are a sign of their spirituality. And so I'm learning about I would say the 5 times a day prayer for me says commitment. That's what it says to me, commitment and fidelity. And I just think it's so beautiful that, wherever you are, you drop everything, and that's the way it should be. Now monks do that, of course. So in the monastic tradition in Christianity, monks will, the bell will ring and they drop everything and they go. And finally, who have been important spiritual teachers for me and what made them stand out? I think, I can list a whole lot of Christian spiritual teachers, but I think in my own life, the word that comes to mind is that it's the people who have been the most free. And I find that it is people who practice spirituality, who have given themselves over to God, who have learned a lot from prayer, from life, who have been open to growth. But really, it's the people who are free. Things don't bother them. They can let things go. They feel happy. And so they may not be famous people. They may not be, well-known writers or whatnot. But it's often, older people I know who have been my spiritual directors and my mentors who are free and can kind of relax about things. I'll tell you a very brief story that always comes to mind. There was a Jesuit I knew who lived with us when we were young Jesuit novices, the first 2 years of formation. He was, it's funny, I used to think of him as very old. I looked back, he was 65 when this story happened. He seemed like he was 100 years old. He's only 4 years older than I am now. And I remember one day I was a very young Jesuit, and this fellow's name was Joe. Went to the airport. He was going to Jamaica, where there were a lot of Jesuits, to visit them. And so he left for the airport in the middle of the day. And then I saw him at night. And I said, what happened? He goes, oh, my flight was canceled. It was just crazy. He said, we went, and they kept delaying it. And then, it got delayed some more. And I had to take the T back to Boston. And boy, it was just such a crazy thing. And I'll go tomorrow. And I thought, oh my gosh, if that were me, I would be just beside myself. But it didn't matter. For Joe, it didn't matter. He'd go the next day. He wasn't attached to that. In Ignatian spirituality, we talk about disordered attachments. You're attached. I have to go today. I have to make. And people like Joe, it's a small thing. That doesn't mean you're a saint just because something like that doesn't bother you. But I think he's free. And like I think all the best of my spiritual teachers, it's freedom. Freedom to be open to God and to let God take you where God wants. So that's a little bit of how I see the spiritual life, which is basically our relationship to God. I would contrast that with religion, which I think is kind of organized spirituality. It's a little, but spirituality really for me is about God, and it's about how we relate to God. And I'm just happy to talk about this tonight with all of you. Both of you and all the people that are listening. So thanks very much for hearing me out.
Thank you, Father James. Thank you very much. You mentioned the flight there, this concept of fate, qadar, from the Muslim perspective, depending on how faithful or spiritual you're able to see everything as being part of a greater plan. So there's a verse in the Quran, very simple, Allah is the best of planners. So it can be difficult to say this, but we need to be able to say maybe a little bit more. This was meant to be. This was meant to be. I didn't plan it. Of course, we have to do everything worldly possible to put things into action. But I remember that because I've also missed a flight. I'm not too sure if I reacted either like you or him. But
well, let me tell you a funny quick story, and I know we have questions. I see people for what we call spiritual direction. So people come to me to talk about their prayer and God, finding God in their daily life. And this one young Jesuit said to me, it was unintentionally funny. Something like that happened. Something upsetting happened, but it all worked out in the end, right? And he said, trying to be pious, he said, God usually knows what God is doing. And I said, oh, usually? He said, no, I know. I was trying to be, realistic. I said, well, I think it's more than usually.
Thank you. And I just want to touch on the issue of, if you will, I don't know if onslaught is appropriate, or even if it's organized or not organized, or it happens to be, but the secularization or the unfaithfulness or the losing of faith. And I know statistics, I've forgotten the statistics in Australia, but the largest or the fastest growing, and it may be the largest
religious group is the non-religious group, and we can tie this to spirituality, but I know we can tie this to Said Nursi, who speaks about the importance of faith, and not just a faith or the faith that we believe in, but the importance of all faiths coming together to work collaboratively to overcome this move to atheism or secularism. Why are people leaving their faith, or in particular their spirituality, outside of organized faith? So I don't know if you want to comment on that, but Said Nursi speaks about this, and I'm a fan, and Zuleyha has written a book on Nursi's approach to inner peace. But I would welcome your thoughts on different faiths coming together, collaboratively working.
If I could just, I realize because I ran out of time, actually, I didn't want to take more time than that was given, but with the question of who have been important spiritual teachers for you, I would say that Said Nursi would be the most important one for me. And that's probably why I wrote my PhD on it, painstakingly spending 67 years writing 90,000 words on inner peace. I'm not sure if it's the best way to attain inner peace, to write a PhD on it, but I've learned a lot along the way, let's put it that way. And that's, I think, one thing that appealed to me about Said Nursi was his realistic approach. Not only, like you meant, he lived at a time when no religion was becoming quite popular. And I resonated with what he was saying. You know, he didn't take for granted that people believed in God. He went to great efforts to prove the existence of God. He didn't take it for granted that Muslims believed in afterlife or resurrection. He went to a lot of effort and a lot of pages to talk about why resurrection is real and it will happen. So I really appreciated his approach. And like Emma mentioned, one other thing is he was seeing how belief in God and, I guess, no belief in God were two currents, and the no belief in God current was coming very strongly. And he did very strongly talk about the importance of people who believe in God to come together. And sadly, we don't always see this today. Instead, what we're seeing is there's rivalry, sometimes conflict, but it does more harm to the cause of God than any benefit. And so he, we're talking about in the 1950s, 60s, he was pushing for this, and it's still relevant today. In Australia, about, I think, 29% of people chose no religion, 2016. That's nearly 1 in 3 in Australia. And we had a census last year. The results will come out, they said, in June, so soon. No, I am confident, or sadly confident, that percentage is going to be higher. Some of those people might be agnostic, some might not have they may have chosen not to write down what their religion is, but no religion is a growing phenomena in the West. And therefore the need for people of God to come together is going to benefit everyone.
James, did you want to comment on that? How faiths could possibly come together against this rising tide of irreligiosity, anti-religion, anti-faith, secularism? They're not necessarily all the same terms, so I'm just throwing them out there. But this general move away from faith, faithfulness, spirituality, are there mechanisms or means for different faiths to come together for that?
Yeah, well, I think there's international groups, certainly. There's efforts like your own, Emery, for Peace Islands. But I also think that there's ways of working together on common issues, I think, that really helps. So Dr. Keskin was talking about that great. I love the example of traveling when everybody becomes themselves. It's really true when you're jet lagged or hungry or tired, and people are just human beings, and Jewish, Muslim, Christian, everybody's hungry, everyone needs to use the bathroom, everyone gets tired, and there's a great commonality. I think that when you're also working together in common, for example, working with, say, refugees, migrants and refugees. I worked in East Africa for 2 years with refugees in Nairobi, Kenya, and we were working with all sorts of groups. And that was, very few of the refugees were Catholic. In fact, a good number of them were Muslim from Somalia, Sudan. We worked with lots of different refugees, and I worked with all sorts of different religious groups, and also, with a mix of religious groups and the refugees. So we were all united in a common effort, and I think that there are so many common things that each of the Abrahamic religions agrees. Caring for the poor, caring for the stranger, caring for widows and orphans, caring for the sick. That I think good works is sometimes a great avenue. And I've noticed that among young people who have lost their faith or are not interested in their faith, at least in the Catholic tradition, those works are often an avenue for them to come to know people who are faithful and say, oh, I admire this person. I wonder what makes them tick. And then they go from there to an interest in, at least being open to these different faith traditions.
Thank you for that, Father James. And you mentioned the travel, and I just remembered a prophetic tradition. Prophet Muhammad tells us that if you want to know somebody, you should either live with them, do business with them, or travel with them. There is a fourth one that an important Muslim scholar that I'm familiar with, Fethullah Gulen, he adds that you do community service with them. So that's significant, both in terms of where we started this and the importance of travel, and B, what you just mentioned about community service. So thank you for bringing that up. So I've got a few questions from our audience. Thank you for those that have contributed. If you have them, we have 10-15 minutes, so please write them in the chat box, and we'll be taking them and I'll be posing them. So we have from Ola Nasser, who is from Briarcliff Manor in New York, and they've asked, what would you like to share with others about your faith that might be misunderstood by others? And maybe both of you could answer that.
Where do I start is the question. To be honest, I'm at a phase of my life where I don't really focus on the misunderstandings. So I might not be able to respond to this question in the best way, but I focus on what I think is important of my faith. And that's why probably I wrote about inner peace. Like, to me, Islam and I can only talk as a Muslim. Islam provides inner peace. It provides contentment. It provides that peace that we're seeking in life, and that's so important, especially I think in a world where mental health issues is a big problem, where I'm not saying that people who have mental health don't have faith or weak faith. I'm not saying that, but it can help positively, strongly contribute towards better dealing with life challenges, is what I'm saying, I guess. And I think that's a really important point that I think about a lot in today's day and age.
Well, I think Dr. Keskin and I have been separated at birth, because I was going to say, where do I begin? There's so many misunderstandings. I think about all the faiths. I think about the three great religions. There's so many, and I'm sure with Hinduism and Buddhism, there's a lot of misunderstanding. I think that there are misunderstandings about chastity. There's misunderstandings about how the Catholic Church, treats women, treats people who are gay. I think the biggest misunderstanding, though, is really the idea that if you believe in these things, if you believe in God, you must be crazy, stupid, deluded. One of my favorite lines from a woman I interviewed a couple decades ago now was that if you're Christian, you leave your brain at the door. And so, I think that we live in such a rational society. Reason obviously is very important, but there are things that are beyond our reason. And I think that, because people cannot, which is true, prove the existence of God, right, in a philosophical proof. I mean, if we could, everybody would be convinced. They think that, God doesn't exist. And I often say, can you believe in a God that you don't understand? Do we need to understand God in order to believe in God? Does God have to fit into our minds to be able to understand it? And so I think that sort of stereotype of the believer as an idiot is really the biggest misconception. I'll tell you a great story. I'm sure you know it, about Saint Augustine, the 4th century saint, and about not understanding God. He was walking on the beach in northern Africa where he lived, and he came across a little boy. It's an apocryphal story, but it's a great story. Digging a hole in the sand on the beach and running back and forth with a bucket and filling it with water. And Augustine is supposed to have said, "What are you doing?" And he said, "I'm trying to fit the ocean into that hole." And Augustine said, "Well, you'll never fit the ocean into that hole. That's impossible." And the little boy said, "Nor will you fit the idea of God into your mind." So I think we live in a world that thinks that we should be able to fit the idea of God in our mind. If we don't, you must be, the God must not exist, and therefore anyone who believes in God is crazy. So to me, that's the biggest misconception about not only Christianity, but religion in general.
Thank you, Father James. We have another question from the audience, and it's from Peter Kovac, who's from Washington, D.C. What kinds of inter-spiritual exchange would you both recommend? What would you discourage and why? Thank you.
Oh, I can start with that. I think going to a house of worship is probably the most powerful for me. You see people not always at their best, but you see them devout and you see them focused. I grew up outside of Philadelphia, and I grew up very close, about 5 minutes away from a friend's meeting house, a Quaker meeting house, and I never set foot in it until I was 27 years old. And the first time I went to their meeting, which is very quiet, it's a very, very simple kind of meeting, I was very moved by that. What things not to do? One of my pet peeves, and I know my Jewish friends don't like this, is with all devotion, many Catholics will do at Passover, in order to understand Jesus, they will do a Seder on their own, a Christian Seder. And my Jewish friends find that just not helpful. And so that's a small practice. They're not doing it as much because I think people know that doesn't really help. Go to a real Seder. Don't kind of make up one on your own. So that's one small thing. But I think going to a house of worship and worshiping in a synagogue or a mosque or a church, depending on your religious tradition, is really helpful and beautiful. And that's how I found it to be. That's the most powerful for me.
Yeah, I would
Thank
say
you.
that it really
Please.
really depends on the person and where they are in their journey, and what those barriers are or guards are there. Like Father James, I wasn't expecting this, but on that trip where we had all our guards down, I went to a church in Rome, and it was quite an experience for me, and I was not expecting it at all. They were singing hymns, and there was just this real atmosphere that impacted me, in ways that I can't explain. But I guess I was ready, or I was open to that experience, and I was open to that having a positive impact on my spirituality as a Muslim. But so that's why what works for me might not work for someone else. It really depends where they are in their journey. Some people love talking about, the scriptures and the similarities and differences. To me, that doesn't do it, if I can put it that way. It's more experiences, but for others, they love it. So I think it's a very personal decision what they feel helps in, spiritually growing by sharing with another faith, with a person of another faith.
Let me just say how much I agree with that. You're absolutely right, because for one person, it might not do anything, or they might not be ready to go into a house of worship. You're right. I mean, they're saying God meets people where they are. Absolutely. And another person might like just talking to someone and asking questions. So yeah, that's a great insight.
Yes, thank you for that. I've had the pleasure of organizing a few, not only mosque open days, but also church visits, cathedral visits, and it does wonders. Of course, I've been in the field of interfaith dialogue for coming on quarter of a century now, which is a while. But I'm astounded, because it's something I've done so often, but I'm so moved by how fresh it is for those that have done it for the first time. It's a very moving experience. And the whole point of dialogue is, of course, it's not a monologue. So, I mean, both sides or three sides or as many sides as they have to exchange in their respective safe places. And as another note, I played a part with my colleagues in DC in organizing a walk through numerous uh, uh, places of worship. So various different types of churches, a synagogue, a Hindu temple, a mosque, etc. So these are things, particularly for those that are watching, that may be new to interfaith engagement. It's something to be able to start at a very grassroots level, no matter where you are, to either open your own place of worship to others, or ask that you visit. And once that matures, you can do various things with numerous places of worship on the same day. So it becomes very meaningful to be able to see how fresh it is when others are moved to tears many times, because they've come with preconceived stereotypes, and they're shattered, and the personal engagement, leaving one's comfort zone, and that zone tends to be not entering someone else's place of worship. I think it's a huge step in terms of spiritual awakening for those that do it and those even that observe it. I want to thank our speakers. That brings us to the end of our event today. So a big thank you to Zuleyha Keskin and Father James Martin. Thank you very much for giving up of your time. For those that are watching this, of course, hit the like button and subscribe to our channel. And there's various other videos. Visit our, of course, YouTube channel to see numerous talks on social justice, on faith and interfaith, and issues that are concerning all, not only all Americans, but all people. So again, thank you.
My pleasure. Can I say shukran?
You just did. You can say it again.
Thanks for having us. And it's been lovely meeting you, Father James.
Thank you. God bless you. Very nice to meet you both.
Pleasure. Have a wonderful day for everyone else. Goodbye for now.
Bye.